When 7 months pregnant Vivian was found broken at the bottom of the stairs, her powerful husband thought money could bury the truth. But he forgot who her parents really were. This is a story about courage, justice, and the moment a survivor remembers her worth. Please support our channel with 1 like and 1 share so we can keep creating more powerful stories. Thanks for watching.
The wet snap of a fist against skin. Then silence, then the slow drip of blood on marble. Vivian Ashford lay crumpled at the bottom of her mansion staircase, 7 months pregnant. 3 feet away, her phone showed an unsent text to her mother. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Preston. I am Scar." The screen was cracked, but the forensics didn't match a timeline in the file. Something was wrong. And you recognize the man in the shadows, don't you? The moonlight caught his face just enough. I am certain it was Preston. To the world, Vivian was perfect, a gift from above. But Preston Ashford believed his money made him a god. He thought his connections could bury the truth, and that Vivian's retired parents, a school teacher and an accountant, were powerless to fight back. He was dead wrong. Because Malcolm Mercer wasn't just an accountant. He was a former CIA deputy director. And Catherine Mercer? She wasn't just a teacher. She was a federal prosecutor who spent her career putting away crime bosses and corrupt senators. What happens when a monster attacks the daughter of people who spent their lives destroying monsters? Stay until the end. The revenge that unfolds will leave you breathless, and the lesson it teaches might save your life. This story carries a heavy truth for any woman trapped in a relationship that has become a prison. Staying in an abusive home isn't weakness, it's survival. And leaving, when you finally find that sliver of courage, that isn't failure. It is reclaiming your life. Vivian's journey reminds us that monsters hide behind designer suits and charming smiles. They isolate you. They make you doubt your own mind. They convince you that you deserve the pain. But here is the secret they don't want you to know. The prison door was unlocked the whole time. You just need to see it. You need someone to believe you. You need one moment of clarity to walk through. If this resonates, please share it. Your share could be the wake-up call that saves a life. The wet snap of a fist against skin, then silence, then the slow drip of blood on cold marble. Those sounds ended the old life of Vivian Mercer Ashford, the life where she posed for cameras, made excuses, and lied to herself that tomorrow would be better. She lay crumpled at the bottom of the grand staircase, 7 months pregnant. Her phone had landed 3 feet away, the screen showing an unsent text, "Mom, I need to tell you something about Preston. I am Scar." She never finished the word scared. She had been so terrified for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be free. Preston stood above her on the landing, chest heaving. His wedding ring had split from the force of the final blow. Her blood dripped from his knuckles onto the Persian runner his mother had imported from Tehran. For a long moment he stared at his unconscious wife, at her broken body, at the curve of her belly where his daughter grew. Then he simply straightened his tie. He stepped over her body, walked into his office, and poured a scotch. It took him 45 minutes to call 911. 45 minutes to craft his lie. 45 minutes to practice the tremor in his voice. She fell down the stairs. Her pregnancy made her clumsy. "I found her like this. Please, hurry. Please help my wife." The paramedics arrived at 11:23 at night. Marcus Chin, a 26-year-old EMT with 4 years on the job, rushed through the front door. He had seen bar fights, car wrecks, and the raw aftermath of violence. But he knew instantly, Vivian Ashford did not fall down those stairs. Falls cause specific, predictable injuries, broken wrists from bracing, contusions on one side. Vivian's body told a much darker story. She had defensive wounds on her forearms. She had knuckle-shaped bruises across her cheekbone. Her orbital bone was fractured from a direct, targeted blow. This wasn't an accident. And beneath the fresh purple marks were older bruises, shifting from yellow to green injuries in different stages of healing. This woman had been beaten for months, maybe years. Marcus looked at Preston Ashford, standing in the doorway with a glass of scotch in his hand. The man's face was a mask of concern, his voice trembling with practiced grief, but his eyes were cold, calculating. Marcus pulled out his phone and started snapping photos of everything. Every bruise, every mark, every piece of evidence Preston was trying to bury. Is that really necessary? Preston asked, a sharp edge cutting through his fake grief. I told you, she fell. Standard procedure, sir, Marcus replied, voice flat. He kept shooting. The ambulance screamed toward St. Catherine's Hospital. In the back, Marcus fought to keep Vivian stable while his partner drove. Her blood pressure was crashing. The baby's heart rate was dangerously erratic. They were both dying. He called ahead to the ER, 32-year-old female, 7 months pregnant. Severe head trauma, multiple contusions, possible internal bleeding. Alert OB and neuro. This is a priority one. He didn't say what he suspected, not over the radio where lawyers could pull the recordings. But when Dr. Rebecca Holloway met them at the bay, Marcus pulled her aside. Doc, I have done this 4 years. That woman didn't fall. Someone beat her half to death. And looking at the old bruises, it wasn't the first time. Dr. Holloway looked at the gurney. She had been Vivian's doctor for 6 months. She had seen the accidents, the excuses, and the way Vivian flinched whenever Preston touched her shoulder. She had suspected, but never had proof. Now she didn't need it. The truth was written in the blood on her patient's skin. Get me copies of those photos, she said. And Marcus, thank you for watching. Inside, the trauma bay exploded into action. Nurses cut away her silk blouse. Monitors shrieked. Doctors barked orders in the sharp, clipped shorthand of an emergency. Her brain is swelling, the neurologist shouted. We need to relieve pressure now or we lose her. The baby is in distress, Dr. Holloway added. Decelerations on the monitor. We might have to deliver tonight. She is only 31 weeks. I know, but if the mother dies, the baby dies too. 200 miles away in a quiet suburb, a phone rang at 11:47. Malcolm Mercer answered on the first ring. At 64, he carried the calm of a man who had spent 30 years handling crises that brought only bad news. His hand was steady, his voice was level. This is Malcolm Mercer. Mr. Mercer, this is St. Catherine's. Your daughter Vivian is in critical condition. You need to come now. Malcolm didn't ask questions. He didn't waste time on details he knew he would get later. He simply said, we are on our way. He walked to the bedroom. Catherine was already awake, sitting up, watching him with eyes that had seen too much in 62 years to ever believe in coincidences. It is Vivian, he said. Catherine's face went still. Not shocked, not tearful. Something colder. Something any lawyer who had ever faced her would have feared. How bad, she asked. Critical. Both of them. Catherine was already reaching for her phone. I am calling Judge Hendricks, she said. I need a hold on all sealed records from the Ashford family. Malcolm paused. You think I have thought about this for 2 years? She stopped packing, her hands frozen over a shirt. I just could not prove it, she whispered, her voice cracking. I could not prove it, and now our daughter might die. In the dim light, Catherine folded the same shirt 3 times, then unfolded it. Her hands were shaking hands that had stayed rock steady while cross-examining murderers and arguing before the Supreme Court. Hands that had put away the most dangerous men in this country. Malcolm crossed the room and took the shirt from her. He pulled her close. We did not know, he said. We should have seen it. We should have. Malcolm's voice turned firm. We could not have known what she wasn't ready to tell us. But we know now, and now we act. Catherine looked at her husband, the retired accountant who grew tomatoes and solved crosswords. The man whose personnel file at Langley remained classified at the highest level. What are you going to do? She asked. Malcolm's face stayed the same, but his eyes changed. They looked like a door opening to a room that had been locked for a decade. Whatever I have to, he said. Whatever it takes to keep her safe and make sure the man who hurt her never hurts anyone again. They drove through the night. 200 miles of silent, dark highway and a cold, sharp fear neither would name. Her voice stayed steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Malcolm drove just over the limit, fast enough to move, slow enough to avoid police. His hands were locked on the wheel, but his mind was already mapping assets, resources, and favors owed. They hit St. Catherine's Hospital at 3:14 a.m. The waiting room was hauntingly quiet, filled only with the desperate. Preston Ashford sat in the private area. Looking the part of the grieving husband, his shirt was rumpled, his hair a mess, his eyes bloodshot, maybe from tears, maybe from scotch. When he saw them, he stood up, his face crumbling into a mask of relief. Oh, thank God you are here. It is just awful. She fell down the stairs. 1 minute fine. The next his voice cracked perfectly. They will not tell me anything. No one will tell me anything. Malcolm studied his son-in-law, specifically the split skin on his knuckles. Poorly hidden by a bandage, he saw a tiny speck of blood on Preston's collar that no dry cleaner could fix. He said nothing. He just sat across from Preston and waited. Catherine sat by her husband, letting him grab her hand. Her face was a perfect portrait of motherly concern. But her other hand, hidden in her coat pocket, was typing rapidly on her phone. Preston kept rambling about accidents and stairs, and how pregnancy made Vivian clumsy, about how he had warned her to be careful and how he found her at the bottom of the stairs and called 911. Malcolm noted every lie. Every rehearsed phrase was just a little too polished. He had interrogated monsters before men who convinced themselves their victims asked for it. He knew exactly what Preston Ashford was, but he stayed quiet, because the quiet, retired accountant knew something Preston did not. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and Malcolm Mercer had 30 years of practice keeping things ice cold. At 4:47 a.m., Dr. Rebecca Holloway asked to see the Mercers privately. She led them into a consultation room, shut the door, and dropped the professional mask. "Your daughter did not fall," she said, her voice tight with fury. "She was beaten. There are injuries in various stages of healing, going back months, maybe years. Her orbital bone is fractured, 3 ribs are broken, 2 are older breaks that never healed right. Defensive wounds on her forearms. Bruising patterns show she was struck repeatedly with a closed fist." Catherine didn't blink. "Did you document everything? Every single mark?" Dr. Holloway locked eyes with her. "I have already contacted the legal team and the police. The EMT took photos. This will not disappear into a folder. I will not let it." Malcolm spoke for the first time. "The baby? We delivered her via emergency surgery at 1:12 this morning," Dr. Holloway said, her voice softening. "She is in the intensive care unit, 3 pounds 2 ounces, 31 weeks. She is a fighter. And Vivian is in surgery. There is swelling in her brain. The neurologist is working to reduce pressure." Holloway hesitated. "I will not lie, it is serious. We do not know if she will wake up." Catherine took the news with the same cold stillness. She nodded once. "What do you need from us?"
For now, just be here when she wakes up, if she wakes up. She is going to need her parents.
"She will need more than that," Malcolm said quietly. "She needs to know she is safe, that he can never touch her again." Holloway looked at the gray-haired man in his cardigan and reading glasses. She wondered what she and everyone else had missed about Malcolm Mercer. "I believe you are right," she said, "and I believe you will make sure of it." She was more right than she knew. Detective Samuel Briggs had been on the job for 27 years. He had seen the absolute worst of humanity. He had learned to turn off his emotions and treat crime scenes like puzzles. But something about this Ashford case made his skin crawl. He arrived at the hospital at 6:15 a.m., answering the call from Dr. Holloway. The Ashford name had triggered a storm of calls, from the chief to the captain to the lieutenant. "Handle this carefully," the lieutenant had said. "The Ashfords built 3 hospitals here. They employ 4,000 people. They fund the police charity every year. Handle it carefully." Briggs knew exactly what that meant. Tread lightly. Don't make waves. Remember who signs the checks. He was sick of that. Marcus Chin, a young EMT, met him in the lobby with an envelope full of photos. The kid's hands were steady, but his jaw was locked in anger. "I have been doing this 4 years, Marcus said. "I know a fall when I see one." That woman did not fall. Briggs spread the photos on a table in an empty room. He saw the bruise patterns and the defensive wounds. He saw the yellowing marks beneath the fresh purple. He saw exactly what Marcus saw. "You documented everything?" he asked. "It wasn't a question. I knew someone would try to bury this," Marcus said. "I would not let it happen." Dr. Holloway joined them with records going back 6 months. ER visits for a sprained wrist, a bruised shoulder, a black eye Vivian claimed happened in the shower. Every injury photographed, a pattern no one had connected until today. "She was my patient for prenatal care," Holloway said. "She always looked nervous when he was in the room. She would flinch if he touched her. I asked once if she was okay, and she changed the subject so fast. I knew the truth. Why didn't you report it?" "Report what?" A woman who flinched, a woman who said she was fine. Dr. Holloway's voice turned bitter. She never admitted it. She never asked for help. I could not force her to talk about what happened behind closed doors. Briggs understood. He had worked these cases before. Victims who protected their abusers' wives more afraid of leaving than staying. A nurse appeared in the doorway, holding a cracked phone in an evidence bag. "We found this," the nurse said. "There is a message she was trying to send." Briggs read the partial text. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Preston. I am Scar. She was trying to tell someone," the nurse said. "And he stopped her," Briggs added. He looked at the evidence. Photos, medical records, a dying cry for help. "This will not be easy. The Ashfords have money and lawyers." Dr. Holloway straightened up. "I don't care. That woman is my patient. That baby is my patient. I will testify to every single thing I have seen. I will not be intimidated." Briggs almost smiled. It was rare to find that kind of grit. "Fine, let me talk to the husband." Preston Ashford's reaction to questioning told Briggs everything he needed to know. For the first few minutes, Preston kept up the act, the worried husband, the devastated partner, the man who could not understand the accident. Then Briggs mentioned the photos, the old injuries, the pattern of abuse. Preston's mask finally shattered. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded. His voice turned cold and hard. Gone was the tremor and the grief. "My family built 3 hospitals in this city. We employ more people than anyone else in the state. You really want to make an enemy of me over my wife's clumsiness? I want the truth, Mr. Ashford." "The truth?" Preston laughed without humor. "The truth is my wife is pregnant and hormonal and has been falling down for months. Ask anyone. Ask her doctor. Ask the staff. I have asked her doctor, and the evidence does not support a fall." Preston's expression shifted, turning calculating. "Then I want my lawyers here for any questions. And I suggest you think very carefully about your career before you push this further." Briggs looked at the man in his expensive suit and his expensive lies. He thought about his pension and his kids' college funds and the lieutenant's warning. Then he thought about the woman upstairs with a fractured skull and her baby fighting for life in an incubator. "I will be in touch, Mr. Ashford." The NICU was quiet at 7 in the morning, just the beep of monitors and the whisper of ventilators. Catherine Mercer stood at the window, watching her granddaughter. 3 pounds, 2 ounces, skin so thin you could see the blue veins underneath. A tube down her throat, breathing for her because her lungs were not ready yet. The baby had no name. Vivian hadn't decided yet. She wanted to meet her daughter first. Now she might never get the chance. Catherine pressed her palm against the cold glass. As a federal prosecutor for 35 years, she had put away monsters, murderers, rapists, men who shattered lives without a second thought. She had held her composure through it all. She believed in the system. She believed justice would prevail. But she had never wanted someone truly destroyed. Until now, she wanted Preston Ashford gone. Malcolm found her an hour later, standing by the incubator. "She is a fighter," he whispered, "just like her mother, like her grandmother." "Malcolm, what do we do?" It wasn't a question of strategy. It was a mother's desperate plea while watching her child fight for every breath. Malcolm went silent. Finally, he spoke. "I made a call." Catherine looked at him. "A call to who?" He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "I spent 30 years working for an agency that officially doesn't exist. I did things that will never be in any history book. I have connections with people who hold secrets most Americans can't even fathom." She waited. "I called in a favor. Langley is sending everything they have on Theodore and Preston Ashford. Every offshore account, every scandal, every witness bought off, every secret they thought was buried." Catherine stared at her husband, the quiet man who just did crossword puzzles. The gentle father who had taught their daughter to ride a bike. "You said you would never use those contacts again. That was before someone tried to kill our child." The words hung in the air. Through the glass, their granddaughter's chest rose and fell with machine-assisted breaths. "I spent my career putting away criminals through legal channels," Catherine said. "Proper evidence, fair trials." "You were the best at it," Malcolm replied. "But this? Using intel assets and classified files, this isn't legal." "No." Malcolm turned to face her. "It isn't. If you want me to stop, I will. If you want to trust the system, I'll step back." Catherine looked at her granddaughter at the monitors, tracking a life that could vanish in an instant. "The system failed our daughter," she said. "The system let him hurt her for years because nobody would see the truth." She turned to Malcolm. "Don't stop. Do whatever you have to do. Don't stop until he can never hurt anyone again." Malcolm nodded once. "I need to make more calls." He left her there at the window. 3 floors up, Vivian lay in a coma while surgeons fought to save her. The swelling in her brain was worse than they feared. They had to remove a section of her skull to relieve the pressure. Nina Vasquez was the night nurse, 28 years old, a nurse for 5 years. She had seen trauma before. She had seen patients in worse shape than Vivian Ashford. But this case haunted her. Maybe it was the pregnancy, the knowledge that this woman was beaten while carrying a child. Maybe it was the parade of expensive lawyers with their demands. Or maybe it was the way Vivian's mother looked at her, not with grief, but with a cold, sharp fury. Nina recognized that look. It was the fury of someone done being helpless, done waiting. At 2:17 in the morning, Nina checked the vitals. She noticed a flicker, lips moving without sound. She leaned close. The words were barely audible. "I tried to be good enough. I tried so hard." Nina felt tears prick her eyes. She had heard it before. Victims who blamed themselves. Women who believed if they had just been better, smarter, more obedient, the abuse would have stopped. "It wasn't your fault," Nina whispered. "Whatever happened, it wasn't your fault." Vivian didn't respond. She slipped back into the chemical darkness, leaving Nina with those hollow words. Later that day, when Catherine Mercer arrived, Nina told her. She said she tried to be good enough, Nina explained. She said she tried so hard. Catherine's hand tightened on her daughter S. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "That's what he told her," Catherine said. "That's what men like him always tell their victims, that it's their fault. That if they were just good enough, the hitting would stop." She leaned close to her daughter's unconscious form. "You were always good enough, sweetheart. You were perfect. He was the broken one. Never you." Nina left them alone, but she made a note in the chart at patient responsive to stimuli, potential emotional trauma. She added a second note for the staff: watch for attempts by the husband to access the patient. Do not allow unsupervised visits under any circumstances. Some things couldn't be fixed by medicine, but they could be protected by vigilance, by people who refused to look away. Malcolm Mercer stood in the parking garage, 3 levels down in a concrete alcove away from cameras. His phone buzzed with encrypted files from contacts who officially didn't exist. Information that would never see a courtroom, but would completely reshape the battlefield. The Ashford family had secrets. Theodore Ashford, Preston's father, built his empire on corruption, bribing inspectors, intimidating competitors, hiding construction defects that had cost lives. Preston learned from the best on how to make problems disappear. But the Ashfords had never faced an enemy like Malcolm Mercer. For 30 years, Malcolm lived in a world where information was currency. He had toppled regimes and turned assets. He had done things that would never appear in official files. He was retired for a decade, but the favors were still owed. The debts were never paid. He started making calls. Within 48 hours, Ashford Development Corporation faced a nightmare. Building inspections, once waived, were suddenly scheduled. Environmental reviews were reopened. Contracts were questioned. 3 major investors received anonymous packages. They contained evidence of financial crimes. Not enough to prove it in court, but enough to make them panic. Enough to make them sever ties with the Ashford family. A journalist at the Washington Post got a tip about Preston's history with women. The details were blurred, but the pattern was clear. This wasn't the first time. There were others who had been paid to stay silent. Others who might finally be ready to talk. Malcolm watched the dominoes begin to fall. He was patient. He was methodical. He had all the time in the world. And Preston Ashford, who had never faced an opponent he couldn't buy, had no idea what was coming. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't play in order. It doesn't respect logic. It floods in fragments. A smell, a sound, a flash of color that unlocks a door you thought was closed. In her coma, Vivian dreamed. She dreamed of a charity gala. Crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, a string quartet playing something classical she couldn't name. She was there representing her nonprofit, raising awareness for domestic violence survivors. The irony would have been painful if she were awake. She remembered laughing at something her friend Denise said, a real unguarded laugh. The kind of laugh she would soon forget how to make. Then she felt eyes on her. She turned and saw Preston Ashford across the room. He was beautiful, her first thought, dark hair, strong jaw, a face for magazine covers. He wore his tuxedo like it was made for him. Everything about him screamed old money and success. The life she only saw in movies. When their eyes met, he smiled. Not a polite social smile, but something warmer. It made her feel like the only person in the room. She would later learn that was his gift, making women feel seen, chosen, and special. It was the hook that pulled them in. The first step in a pattern he had spent years perfecting. But that night, she didn't know. She was just Vivian Mercer, 30 years old, devoted to her work, and lonely in a way she didn't admit. When Preston Ashford introduced himself, she felt something new. Possibility. The courtship was a whirlwind. Private dinners, trips to Paris, London, and a private island in the Caribbean. Flowers arrived every single day until her office dubbed her desk the botanical garden. He called every night, showed up at events with an intensity that left her feeling drunk without a drop of alcohol. She would later learn the term for this love bombing, a deliberate trap designed to create total dependency. But at the time, she just felt like the only woman in the world. She told her therapist later, "I didn't realize he wanted me to be the only woman in his world, like I didn't exist outside of him." The isolation started slow, subtle, fake concern. "Your friend Denise seems critical," he'd say. "I am just worried about you. Your boss asks too much of you. You don't need that stress. I can take care of us. Your apartment is just too small. Why not move into my place? We would have more space, more time." Slowly, her world shrank. Her friends became strangers. Her career faded away. Her car, her savings, her own identity, all absorbed into his. By the time she realized what was happening, she was trapped in his mansion, dependent on his money, surrounded by his hand-picked staff and his cold, judging friends. They looked at her like she was a new trophy, a possession. 8 months in, the first hit landed. She attended a charity event he'd forgotten about. She came home buzzing, proud of the families she'd helped. She found him waiting in the dark living room. "Where the hell were you?" It wasn't a question, it was a sentence. His voice was flat, controlled, more terrifying than any scream. She started to explain the fundraiser, the families, the work, but the slap came so fast she didn't see it coming. She hit the floor, ears ringing, reality spinning. Then, he was on his knees, sobbing, pulling her into his arms. "I was so scared," he cried. "I love you too much. I cannot help it. I am so sorry. Never again." She believed him. That was the tragedy that haunted her even in her sleep. She apologized Todd for scaring him. She promised to report every move. She took his tears as proof of love, never seeing the manipulation. It is the classic cycle of abuse. Tension, incident, reconciliation, calm. Then it starts all over again. Each time her spirit eroded. Leaving gets harder every time. The victim starts questioning their own reality. The second hit came 2 months later. The third just weeks after that. Each apology cost more. Each calm period lasted less time. She learned to read his moods. She became silent, small, and agreeable. She mastered the art of hiding bruises with makeup and covering up injuries with lies. She became an expert at faking a happy life for the cameras. She hated herself for it. 2 in the morning. Catherine sat in the hospital chapel. She wasn't religious, but she needed a quiet place where the crushing weight of the last 24 hours could land. The chapel was small, simple, and cold. The kind of place hospitals built for families just like hers. Families needing comfort that no doctor could give. Catherine closed her eyes, remembering when they first brought Vivian home. 2 years old, huge brown eyes and a smile that could light up any room. She had been abandoned in a grocery store parking lot as a baby. Catherine and Malcolm had tried for years to have their own children, enduring endless, painful procedures that left them empty. When their final attempt failed, they had almost given up on parenthood. Then came the call about a little girl who needed a home. "We chose each other," Catherine always told Vivian. "That is more powerful than blood." Now she wondered if that love was enough. They had loved her, protected her, and still couldn't save her from the monster who smiled at Gallus. Where did we fail? She whispered the question to the empty room. There was no answer, only the crushing weight of guilt. Outside the intensive care unit, Malcolm stared at a cup of cold, forgotten coffee. He was haunted by a memory from 3 years ago. A Sunday phone call. "Dad, I met someone. I think this is it." The joy in her voice still echoed in his mind. He had been so happy for her. God forgive him, he had been so happy. He welcomed Preston without question. He shook his hand at the wedding and toasted to their future. He should have dug into his background. He should have trusted his instincts, which had prickled the moment they met. But he wanted his daughter to find love so badly that he chose to look away. Malcolm stared at the coffee, seeing nothing. "I should have protected you," he thought. 2 floors down in the neonatal unit, a nurse named Maria sang softly to a baby. The song was a lullaby her grandmother once sang in Spanish. The baby was tiny, fighting for every breath, but Maria sang anyway because sometimes the things that matter most cannot be measured by machines. The presence of another human, the sound of a voice, the simple, powerful act of not being alone. "Hold on, little one," she whispered. "Your mama needs you." Detective Samuel Briggs sat in his car outside the station, staring at the file. 22 years on the force, and he had learned to trust facts over feelings. The evidence in the Ashford case was damning. Medical records, photos, and witness statements, it was a clear pattern of abuse. But evidence alone rarely won cases against families like the Ashfords. Phone buzzed. The captain. "Briggs, get in here now." The office was small and cluttered with awards. Captain Morrison was a decent man, but he was deep in the political game. "Close the door," he said. "I am getting calls. The chief, the mayor, people I haven't spoken to in years." Morrison rubbed his temples. "They want to know why we are making noise about an accidental fall." "It was not an accident," Briggs snapped. "I know the evidence." Morrison cut him off. "I have seen it, Briggs. I know exactly what Preston did." "Then why are we here?" "Because knowing and proving are 2 different things. The Ashfords have the best lawyers in the country. They will bury us in motions. They will drag this out until everyone is exhausted. And Preston will walk away with a slap on the wrist. So we just let him go?" "I did not say that." Morrison leaned in. "We need to be smart. We need an airtight case. We need evidence his money cannot touch. I need more." Morrison slid a folder across the desk. "I ran some quiet inquiries on the parents, Vivian's adoptive parents." Briggs opened the file. He read the first page, then the second. He looked up at his captain in pure shock. Malcolm Mercer was not just an accountant. He was a retired deputy director of the CIA in Catherine, a legendary federal prosecutor who had taken down crime families. Briggs shut the folder. "The Ashford family is about to make powerful enemies, I am telling you." Morrison almost smiled. "I don't think they realize what is coming." Preston Ashford sat in his study, surrounded by old money. Leather-bound books he never cracked. Portraits of ancestors who built their fortune by crushing others. A desk older than the nation itself. His lawyers promised him he was untouchable. His wife might pull through, or she might not. Either way, the story was locked in. A tragic accident, a grieving husband, and a family shattered by bad luck. The Mercers were a manageable nuisance, just greedy relatives fishing for the Ashford fortune. That was the official line. The media would parrot it. The judge would swallow it when the legal motions hit his desk. Preston sipped his coffee, unbothered. He had survived worse. Money fixed problems. Lawyers sanded down the rough edges. Power made scandals vanish into thin air. Then his phone buzzed. His lead attorney sounded rattled. "We have a crisis," he said. "What kind?" The judge just recused himself over financial questions. Preston felt the coffee turn to bile. "Patterson, Botman, who is looking at his books?" The lawyer hesitated. "It gets worse. Regulators are launching surprise inspections. The Riverside project is under fire. The Environmental Agency is reopening every file. And the Washington Post is sniffing around your past with women." Preston dropped his cup. His hand was trembling. "That is impossible. It is happening," the attorney hissed. "Someone is hunting you. Someone who knows where the bodies are buried." "Find them," Preston snapped. "I am trying, but they are ghosts. Very good ghosts." Preston hung up and stared at his father's portrait above the hearth. Theodore Ashford's painted eyes seemed to sneer. "You taught me to never blink," Preston thought. "You taught me to bury my enemies before they could breathe." So how do I kill a shadow? The neonatal unit was deathly quiet. Malcolm stood by the glass, watching his granddaughter sleep. She had gained a tiny bit of weight. Her breathing was stronger. Doctors were hopeful. But hope is not the same as safe. It is a long way from the life she deserves. His phone vibrated with a file from his contacts at Intelligence. More dirt on the Ashfords. Malcolm scanned the summary. Theodore Ashford was a monster. 30 years of abusing his wife until she died from injuries labeled as a car wreck. He had ruined staff and partners alike. He had molded Preston in his own image. He taught his son that power meant zero consequences, that women were trophies, that violence was just another tool in the box, like father, like son. Malcolm thought of the man in the hospital wing, the man who faked smiles for cameras and beat a pregnant woman into a coma, the man who learned cruelty as an art form. Theodore was dying of cancer, escaping justice. But his son would not. Malcolm dialed an old friend in private security. I need everything on Preston, every woman he ever dated. Anyone he silenced. That is a tall order, the friend replied. Malcolm watched his granddaughter's chest rise and fall. I am calling in every debt I have accrued over 30 years. I want this man ruined. I want his name to be a warning. There was a pause. You were never this ruthless when you were on the job. I never had a granddaughter fighting for her life before. The line went silent. I will see what I can dig up. Catherine found him there an hour later. She stood beside him, watching the baby. You are starting a war, she said. It was not a question. Yes, is it legal? Catherine considered it. She had lived her life by the rulebook. But the system failed Vivian. It let Preston hurt her for years because nobody wanted to look, nobody wanted to speak, and nobody wanted to risk their own comfort to save a woman who could not save herself. Good, Catherine said. Do whatever it takes. Malcolm looked at her, the partner he had loved for 40 years. This is going to get ugly. I hope it does, she replied coldly. I hope it gets so ugly he wishes he had never been born. Malcolm nodded. I need to make calls. Day 12, Vivian suffered a brain bleed. At 2:47 in the morning, the alarms shattered the silence. Nurses sprinted. Doctor shouted, total chaos. Malcolm and Catherine stood in the hall when Dr. Holloway approached. Her face told them everything. A complication. We need to operate now, or we lose her. Catherine's legs gave out. Malcolm caught her, his face a mask of iron control. Do whatever is necessary, he said. Save her. The surgery lasted 6 hours. They sat in the chapel, not praying. They didn't believe in that, just sitting in the heavy silence, holding hands, waiting for news that would either break them or heal them. Then Catherine snapped. A tremor in her shoulders, then a sound of pure agony. She was sobbing. The first time he had seen her cry since her own mother's funeral. She was trying to leave him, Catherine whispered. She was trying to run, and we never knew. We failed her. Malcolm pulled her close. He didn't offer empty comfort. He just held his wife while she grieved for the red flags they missed, the questions they never asked, and the way they were blinded by Preston's mask. We will make this right, he promised. While Vivian fought to survive, Preston struck back. His legal team moved to seize control, claiming Vivian was mentally unfit. They tried to block the Mercers, labeling them as outsiders looking for a payout. He hired a high-end PR firm. Preston went on TV, delivering a performance for the ages. He wore a soft sweater that made him look vulnerable. He held a photo of their wedding. His voice broke right on cue. I just want my wife back, he told the cameras. I love her. Why are her parents keeping me away? The clip went viral instantly. The internet exploded with support. A fake fund appeared for his legal costs. People wrote articles about meddling in-laws. The public turned on the Mercers. Suddenly, they were the villains, the ones tearing a husband from his dying wife. Detective Briggs got pulled from the case, a conflict of interest. They called it procedure. His captain couldn't even look him in the eye, apologizing for a machine he couldn't stop. Preston's money was working exactly as planned. 3 in the morning, Catherine sat in the empty hospital cafeteria. The lights hummed like a low-grade migraine. The vending machines clicked and buzzed. Catherine stared at a bowl of soup that had grown a skin. In 35 years as a prosecutor, she had lost cases. She had watched predators walk free on technicalities. She had accepted that justice was flawed, but believed the system was better than anarchy. Now she didn't know. Preston was going to win. He had the cash, the lawyers, the spin, and a society that always bets on men like him. He would win, and Vivian, if she survived, would face years of hell. A brutal divorce, a custody fight over the baby, and endless legal warfare while Preston played the victim for the world to see. Catherine knew the drill. The system was built to destroy families just like theirs. Mothers losing children to fathers with expensive lawyers, women ground down to nothing. She wouldn't let that happen to Vivian. Malcolm found her staring at cold soup. He sat opposite her. The silence stretched between them. 40 years of marriage taught them words weren't always needed. Finally, Catherine whispered, "I keep thinking about when she was little." Malcolm waited. She used to have nightmares. She'd crawl into bed and say, "I dreamed the bad people came for me." And I'd tell her, "No one can hurt you. Mommy and Daddy won't let them." She looked at Malcolm, eyes bloodshot. "We lied to her. We didn't, we lied. We promised to protect her. Someone hurt her for years and we didn't see it. We didn't stop it. All our training, our skills, our contacts, we couldn't protect our own daughter." Malcolm took her hand. "Catherine, we can't change the past, but we control the future." "How?" "With your spy contacts and my legal connections." None of that has stopped him from putting her in a coma. "No," Malcolm's voice was low, jagged. "None of that saved her, but it will destroy him." He squeezed her hand. "I promise, Catherine, Preston Ashford will lose everything. His money, his name, his freedom. By the time we're finished, he will be a cautionary tale every abuser thinks about before raising a hand." Catherine looked at her husband, the quiet man, the gentle father, the retired spy who stepped out of the shadows for his most important mission. "Promise me," she said. "I promise." The surgery ended at 8:43. Dr. Holloway found them in the chapel, holding hands, waiting for a verdict. "She is alive," the doctor said. The words seemed heavy. "She's alive." The bleeding stopped. "We relieved the pressure, but I won't lie to you. The next few days are critical. We don't know the extent of the damage. We don't know if she will wake up. I'm sorry, I can't be more certain." Dr. Holloway looked exhausted. "Brain injuries are unpredictable. Sometimes they surprise us. Can we see her?" "Yes, she is in the ICU now. You can sit with her." The room was quiet. Monitors beeped. Vivian lay still, head bandaged, tubes snaking everywhere. Malcolm stood at the bedside, looking down. "I didn't protect you," he whispered, "but I'm going to fix that. I'll make sure he never hurts anyone again." He watched over her until dawn, waiting, planning. 2 a.m, Malcolm drove through empty streets. He parked outside the Ashford mansion, the place where his daughter was nearly beaten to death. The windows were dark. Preston was inside, sleeping soundly, confident that money and lawyers would bury the truth. Malcolm sat there for an hour, watching. Thinking, in another life, he would have handled this differently, a quiet solution, something that could never be traced. But that isn't who he was anymore. It's not who Vivian raised him to be. Yes, raised because parenthood isn't just about teaching your children, it's about what they teach you. Vivian taught him there were better ways to defeat monsters than becoming one. He drove away. A better path existed, one that didn't just stop Preston Ashford but destroyed him publicly and legally. It would take time, but the end would be worth it. Day 18. Vivian became aware of sound. Beeping monitors, a distant voice calling her name, the soft whoosh of air, then pain, a deep throbbing ache pulsing with every heartbeat. Her body felt heavy, wrong, disconnected. She tried to open her eyes, too bright. She closed them. "Vivian," the voice was closer, familiar. "Vivian, can you hear me?" Nina, the nurse. The one from the dark hours, the one from her coma dreams. She tried to speak, but her throat was sandpaper. Her lips cracked. The word came out as a desperate croak, "Baby." Nina's face came into focus. Tears streamed down the nurse's cheeks. "She is okay. She is in the neonatal unit. She is a fighter, just like her mama." Vivian processed it. Her daughter survived. They both survived. The second question was harder. "Where is Preston?" Nina's expression shifted. She looked careful. "He is not here right now." "Don't let him near me," Vivian gasped. "Please." "I won't," Nina promised. "I promise, no one will hurt you again." Catherine and Malcolm were called to the room within the hour. They had been in the cafeteria, drinking their third cup of coffee, reviewing intel from Malcolm's contacts. When they walked in and saw Vivian's eyes open, Catherine let out a sob. "Oh, baby." She crossed the room in 3 steps, pulling her daughter into a careful hug. Oh, my baby. I was going to tell you, Vivian whispered. Her voice was weak but steady. I was trying to tell you that night. I was texting Mom when she couldn't finish. You don't have to explain, Catherine said, holding her face. We know everything, it's over, he will never touch you again. Malcolm stood at the foot of the bed. His face was calm, but his eyes were dangerous. How long? Vivian asked. You've been unconscious for 18 days, Dr. Holloway explained. The surgery, the complications, the recovery. You are stable now, and so is the baby. Vivian nodded slowly, pieces fitting together. 18 days, 3 weeks of her life gone. 3 weeks of her baby's life she missed. I want to see her, she said. I want to see my baby. Holloway exchanged a look with Catherine. Soon, when you're stronger. She is doing remarkably well. 33 weeks, gained a pound, breathing on her own. Vivian closed her eyes as tears leaked out. I was going to leave him, she whispered. I had a plan. I was getting out. Catherine gripped her hand. We know, and you still will. You are getting out, and you will be free. He is going to spend his life paying for this. Something in her mother's voice made Vivian look up. A hardness she had never heard, a promise wrapped in steel. Mom, what are you doing? What we should have done years ago, Catherine said, protecting our daughter. Detective Briggs visited off-duty. He had been tracking the case, building a file through unofficial channels that no superior authorized. He sat beside the bed. Mrs. Ashford, I need to ask, do you want to press charges against your husband? Vivian looked at her parents, then at the photo of her baby taped to the wall. 3 pounds, a tiny fist raised in defiance. Yes, she said, her voice stronger now. I want to press charges. I want to testify. I want him to look me in the eye when I tell the world what he did. Briggs nodded. We will work together. It won't be easy. The Ashfords have power. They fight dirty. I know, Vivian said. But I am done being afraid. I am done hiding. I am done protecting the man who tried to kill us. I stayed because I felt ashamed, she added later, when only her parents remained. I stayed because I was ashamed, Vivian repeated. Catherine squeezed her hand. But I'm not ashamed anymore. Vivian's voice turned cold. I'm furious. 3 days later, she was strong enough for the wheelchair. Nina pushed her through the quiet halls, past hushed voices, worried families, and the digital rhythm of life-saving machines. The nursery was warm, dim, designed to mimic the womb. Nina stopped the chair in front of an incubator. Here she is, the nurse said softly. Your daughter. Vivian peered through the plastic at the tiny form inside. 3 pounds. Hooked to monitors, but breathing, living, fighting. She pressed a palm to the warm plastic. Hello, baby, she whispered. I'm your mama. I am so sorry it took me so long to meet you. The baby's hand twitched, fingers flexing against the blanket. Can I hold her? Arrangements were made. Careful hands transferred the bundle to her mother. Vivian held her for the first time. 3 pounds of impossibility. Translucent skin, blue veins, eyes closed against a world she wasn't ready for, but warm. Alive, her daughter. Her reason for everything coming next. I'm going to name you Rose, Vivian whispered, because roses grow thorns to protect themselves. And you're going to need thorns, baby. The world is hard. Rose Catherine Mercer. A new name for a new beginning. Catherine stood at the window, watching them. Malcolm stood by her side. She is going to be okay, he said. Catherine's voice burned with fury. She will do better than okay. She will thrive. She will raise that baby, help other survivors, and watch Preston Ashford spend his life, knowing he failed to destroy her. Malcolm studied his wife, the prosecutor, the mother, the woman who spent 35 years trusting the system only to watch it crumble. I love you, he whispered. I love you too, Catherine replied, eyes still locked on the window. Now, let Esco destroy our son-in-law. The Washington Post headline hit like a shockwave. CEO's history of violence, 3 women tell their stories. The report was surgical, legally sound, and brutal. Preston had dated these 3 before Vivian. Same patterns every time. The charm, the isolation, the first hit out of nowhere, then the tears and hollow promises. One woman even took $200,000 to stay silent. Another dropped charges after they threatened her family. The third simply vanished, too broken to fight. Now they were ready to talk. They were ready to watch Preston Ashford finally pay. Malcolm's connections found them, and Catherine's legal team protected them. Together, they gave these women the courage to speak. Preston's SPR team scrambled. pushing denials, spin, and smear campaigns against the victims. It didn't work. When the first domino falls, the rest follow. Harrison Cole, Preston's CFO and best friend, was arrested for fraud on Tuesday. The evidence was damning: offshore accounts, fake records, 15 years of corruption. Harrison was the fixer who knew where all the bodies were buried. He flipped within 6 hours. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he handed over everything: bribery, witness tampering, and proof of Preston's past abuse. Preston's own texts to Harrison were chilling, discussing how to make problems disappear. "She is getting too independent. We need to bring her back in line." Maybe a trip to the hospital that worked with Jennifer. That alone was enough, but there was more. Margot Ashford, Preston's mother, was served a subpoena Wednesday. Her attempts to cover up her son's violence, paying off girlfriends, and threatening witnesses were now part of a criminal case. She called Preston in a panic. "I am facing criminal charges," she shrieked. "Because of you." "Mother, calm down. We have lawyers. Lawyers won't help us now," Margot sobbed. "They know everything, every payment, every threat, every witness we hid. We are going to prison," Preston spun, "both of us. It won't happen. It is already happening. They told me to surrender my passport. I can't leave the country." Preston hung up, his hands shaking too hard to hold the phone. Theodore Ashford, Preston's father, died Thursday morning. Cancer claimed him before the law could. In his final hours, doped up on pain meds, Theodore confessed to his nurse. "I taught him everything," he mumbled. "How to handle women, how to keep them in line. His wife, the first one, she wanted to leave me. I couldn't let that happen. I had to teach her what happens when a woman forgets her place." The nurse recorded every word. When Theodore passed, she called Detective O'Briggs. "He confessed," she said, "to what he did to his wife and to training his son to do the same." Briggs listened to the recording 3 times before adding it to the massive case file. Friday afternoon, the board of Ashford Development Corporation held an emergency meeting. Preston sat at the head of the table, surrounded by men who had profited from his family for 20 years. Men who had looked the other way when whispers of Preston's temper started. When his wife's accidents occurred, they weren't looking away anymore. "Preston, it is over," the chairman said. He had known Theodore since they were boys. "The company cannot survive this. The lawsuits, the media, our stock is down 40%. Partners are leaving. Lenders are calling in loans. This is temporary," Preston insisted. "When the dust settles." "The dust isn't going to settle," another board member snapped. "You are facing criminal charges. Your mother is too. Your CFO is singing to the feds. You are done, Preston. The only question is if you drag this company down with you. What are you saying? We are demanding your resignation, effective immediately. If you fight us, we will force you out. This is not a negotiation." Preston looked around at the men he had known forever. The wedding guests, the golf buddies. They had known who he was all along. They were dumping him now, not because of his crimes, which they tolerated for decades, but because he was costing them money and prestige. "You will regret this," Preston threatened. "We already regret many things," the chairman replied. "But this isn't one of them." Preston's world fell apart. His assets were frozen. His clubs kicked him out. His phone stopped ringing as everyone suddenly found better things to do. The mansion was seized as proceeds of crime. He was reduced to a hotel suite, paying with cards about to be canceled. Alone, save for lawyers charging $500 an hour to bring bad news. Then he did something stupid. He went to the hospital. Malcolm was in the lobby when Preston walked in. The younger man looked disheveled, red-eyed, and desperate. "I want to see my wife," Preston demanded. "I have rights." Malcolm stepped firmly between him and the elevators. He didn't yell or threaten. He just looked at his son-in-law with the cold gaze of a man who spent 30 years hunting targets. "Leave," Malcolm said. "She is my wife. I have legal rights. Your daughter is still carrying my name. Your daughter's smallest name is Rose Catherine." "Mercer," Malcolm said, his voice like ice. "She will never know you existed. She will never know her father was a monster. She will grow up loved, protected, and safe from people like you." Preston's face twisted. "You think you won? You think your spy games beat me? My lawyers are negotiating plea deals because they know what is coming." Malcolm stepped closer. "Let me explain something. I spent 30 years working for people who handle problems quietly and permanently. I am retired. but I still have friends. Friends who owe me favors, friends who can make things happen that leave no trail. Preston paled. I am not going to hurt you. Malcolm continued. That would be too easy. Instead, I am going to watch everything you built burn. I am going to watch you dragged through court, humiliated and locked in a cell. And I will find peace knowing you are rotting away, realizing you have zero power over my daughter or anyone else ever again. Malcolm offered a cold, empty smile. Keep fighting, Preston. It just makes the destruction so much more satisfying. Preston stared at the older man. The quiet grandfather who liked crossword puzzles now seemed more terrifying than any thug. He left without a word. That night, Preston sat alone in his empty suite. The staff had stopped showing up. The phone was silent. He poured scotch with shaking hands, finally realizing he had no idea what came next. 6 months later, the courthouse stood grand and imposing. It was built in an era when justice felt heavy and permanent. Vivian walked through the doors with her mother and Detective Briggs. She wore a simple dress and a thin gold rose pendant, a gift from Nina, the nurse who became a friend. She was terrified. She had dreaded this day for months, the moment she would have to face him in public and tell her truth to the world. But beneath the fear was something else, something solid. A resolve that had been growing since she woke up in that hospital bed after he tried to end her life. The room was packed. Journalists scribbling for headlines, advocates and curious spectators watching the powerful CEO fall. Preston sat at the defense table with his expensive team. He looked different now, thinner, beaten. His polish wore thin, revealing the rot underneath. Vivian entered. He turned, eyes cold. She didn't flinch, didn't give him that win. She walked to the stand, head held high. The prosecutor, Lisa Chen, had been handpicked by Catherine's legal circle. She was sharp, relentless, and focused on putting abusers away. Mrs. Mercer, she began, tell the court about your marriage to Preston Ashford. Vivian told everything. The charm, the isolation, the first hit out of nowhere. The tears, the fake apologies, the empty promises. She detailed the escalation, broken ribs hidden from doctors, black eyes brushed off as accidents, the constant, suffocating fear. She recounted the night she nearly died, that text she tried to send, the sound of his fist, the fall down the stairs, and finally, the dark. She spoke for 3 days. Her voice cracked, her hands shook, but she never quit. She looked at the jury, speaking her truth. He told me nobody would believe me, she said. He said I was lucky to have him. That I was nothing without him. She paused. He was dead wrong. The evidence was brutal. Medical records, hidden accounts, and testimony from 8 other women he had destroyed. Harrison Cole took the stand, detailing 20 years of cover-ups, hush money, and threats. Dr. Holloway confirmed the pattern of abuse she suspected but couldn't prove until Vivian's broken body hit her ER. Nina testified about the words Vivian whispered in her coma. I tried to be good enough. I tried so hard. Then, the prosecution played Preston's own text messages for the court. His own voice recorded for history. I will kill you if you ever try to leave. You belong to me. The jury listened. The defense team tried to trash Vivian's character, claiming a conspiracy against an innocent man. It failed. When Preston took the stand, his mask finally slipped. The prosecutor grilled him on the texts, the payoffs, and the years of systematic violence. His charm vanished. His composure snapped. He screamed at the prosecutor, called Vivian a liar, and threatened the judge. The jury saw the monster. They saw exactly what Vivian had survived for 3 long years, 4 hours of deliberation. When they returned, the 4 women stood facing the defendant. On attempted murder, guilty. On aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. On witness tampering, guilty. On financial crimes, we find him guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. As the verdict hit, Vivian closed her eyes. She remembered every time she apologized for his anger, believing it was her fault. It was never my fault, she whispered. It was never my fault. Catherine held her hand tight. No, sweetheart. It never was. 4 weeks later, sentencing. The room was quiet. Vivian had spent weeks on a victim impact statement trying to capture the uncapturable. She kept it simple. Preston Ashford tried to kill me, she read. He beat me, degraded me, and made me believe I deserved it. He tried to erase me from existence so completely that I would disappear and the truth would die. She looked at Preston. He stared back with empty eyes. But I am still here, she said. My daughter is here. You have no power over us anymore. She stepped down. Judge Patricia Reynolds was 72, a veteran of the bench who had seen it all. She usually kept her cool, but as she looked at Preston Ashford, her expression turned to stone. "Mr. Ashford," she began, "you had every advantage. Wealth, education, connections that opened any door. You could have been anything. Instead, you chose to terrorize and nearly murder a woman who trusted you. You used your money to silence victims and dodge justice. You thought your wealth made you untouchable." Her voice dropped. "You were wrong." The courtroom went dead silent. "You are not a victim. You are a predator who thought the rules didn't apply. You abused multiple women, nearly killed your pregnant wife, and used your resources to hide your crimes." Judge Reynolds adjusted her papers. "I sentence you to 25 years to life. You won't be eligible for parole for 15 years. Your assets will be liquidated to pay restitution to the women you harmed. You will be added to the violent offender registry, and you will never contact your former wife or your daughter." Preston S. face went white. "I hope the next 15 years give you time to reflect on your actions, though I doubt you are capable of it." She banged her gavel. "Court is adjourned." As he was cuffed, he looked back for Vivian. He wanted any reaction. She wasn't looking. She was checking her phone. Catherine had sent a photo. Rose, now 6 months old, was thriving, smiling for the first time. A real smile, the kind that made everything else melt away. Vivian smiled back at the screen while Preston Ashford vanished into the corridor toward prison. She never looked back. The fallout hit the city's power structure like a wildfire. The Ashford name, once a badge of power, became a synonym for disgrace. Partners fled, society friends acted like they were strangers, and charities scrubbed his name from their walls. Moscone Ashford Wellington pleaded guilty to lesser charges and served 5 years in federal prison before fleeing to Europe to die in obscurity. Harrison Cole served 3 years, emerging broken, unemployable, and totally ostracized. All over the city, in boardrooms and private clubs, a story spread. They whispered about the quiet, retired couple who had destroyed a CEO, about the reach of their power, about what happens when you hurt their daughter. Malcolm and Catherine never said a word. They didn't have to. The fear of the Mercers became a legend. A year later, Vivian stood in a new doorway, a converted downtown warehouse. Modest space, exposed brick, used furniture, but it was hers. The sign read the Rose Foundation. It had taken a year to build this from the ashes of her old life. A year of therapy and finding her own strength. The Rose Foundation provided free legal resources and support for survivors, emergency housing, legal advice, court advocacy. Everything she had needed but never found when she was trapped in Preston's web. This was her, turning pain into purpose, ensuring no other woman would walk that road alone. Rose Catherine Mercer was 18 months old now. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubborn chin. She was learning to walk, taking wobbly steps across the floor at the Westbrook house. She would never know Preston Ashford. She would never learn her father was a monster. She would grow up surrounded by love and the fierce protection of a family that would do anything to keep her safe. Sunday dinner was a tradition again. Vivian helped her mother cook while Malcolm played blocks on the floor with Rose. The smell of pot roast filled the air. Laughter echoed through the halls. "Dad." Vivian watched as Malcolm hammed it up for little Rose. "What did you actually do at the CIA?" she asked. Malcolm looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I was an accountant. You were not just an accountant. I was an accountant who dealt with some very unusual situations." Vivian let out a genuine, free laugh, the first in years. It was the sound of a woman who had walked through hell and finally made it out. Rose toddled over, arms reaching up. Vivian pulled her close, anchoring herself. "Your grandpa is being mysterious," she whispered to her daughter. "It is going to be a thing. Get used to it." Malcolm locked eyes with Catherine across the room. 40 years of marriage, and they didn't need to speak. They had done what they set out to do. Their daughter was safe. Their granddaughter was thriving. The man who had terrorized them both would rot in a cell for 15 years. It felt small. It would never be enough for the abuse, the early birth, or the scars that refused to fade. But it was justice. It was a start. That night, after Rose drifted off in what used to be Vivian's old bedroom, They sat on the porch. The air was warm, crickets chirping in the dark, stars glowing brightly above the city. Catherine brought 2 cups of tea. "You know," Vivian said quietly, "I used to think I was just weak." Catherine waited, listening. "I thought I stayed because I wasn't strong enough to leave, that everything was my fault. If only I were smarter, braver, better. I thought I would have spotted his true colors sooner. But now, I know it takes immense strength to survive what he did to me, to wake up and keep going while someone systematically dismantles your life, to smile and fake it, because that is the only way to survive another day." Vivian turned to her mother. "I wasn't weak, Mom. I was surviving. That is the hardest battle of all." Catherine took her hand. "You were never broken, Vivian. You were just waiting for the right moment." "What moment?" "The moment you remembered exactly who you were. The moment you realized you deserved better. The moment you chose yourself." Vivian went quiet, her tea cooling in her palms as the stars slowly shifted overhead. The prison door was unlocked the whole time, she realized. I just could not see it because he had convinced me I belonged in a cage. But I never did. She looked at her mother. No one does. 6 months later, a letter arrived at the office. Preston wanted visitation rights. Vivian read the letter once. She studied the neat script, the formal tone, and the toxic threats buried in polite language. He wanted access to his daughter. He wanted a leash on the life he had destroyed. He wanted to prove he still had a grip on her. She did not bother to respond. Instead, she took the letter home and tossed it into the fireplace of her small apartment, the home she had earned, furnished, and paid for all on her own. She watched the paper turn to ash. Then she grabbed her daughter, stepped into the golden sunlight, and never looked back. The past was dead. Preston Ashford was locked away, forgotten and irrelevant. He held no power over her or Rose anymore. Some monsters wear suits. They smile for the cameras, shake hands, and donate to charities. They hide in plain sight, protected by status and people too afraid to speak. But monsters fall, not by other monsters, but by ordinary people who refuse to look away. By parents who stand guard and survivors who find their voice. Vivian Mercer did not need saving. She needed time to see clearly, time to speak, and time to remember the woman she was before the gaslighting started. She was never weak. She was just waiting for the right moment to burn the cage down. If this story hit home for you, if it made you feel something, I want to ask you for 3 simple things today. First, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. We drop stories like this every week to empower you. Second, leave a comment. Have you ever known someone trapped like Vivian? What would you tell them? Third, share this video. Send it to a friend or post it. You never know who is struggling in silence, waiting for a sign that they are not alone. Your support reaches the women who need it most. Together, we are building a community that refuses to stay silent. This content was carefully researched and edited by our team to deliver powerful entertainment with real-world lessons. Every story we share is designed to do more than just captivate you. We want to leave you with wisdom, hope, and the reminder that you are stronger than you think. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this journey with us.